Shall we start?
Yes, sir, we can start.
I think others will be joining. Let us start.
Right.
Good number
Yes.
of people have already come.
Yes.
Okay. A very good afternoon to all of you who have joined, who have registered and joined for our distinguished lecture number 42. And to this lecture, I welcome you all. You are from different places in India. And I also welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Devdip Mukhopadhyay, who is the Institute Chair Professor, Department of Computer Science and Engineering, Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. His topic is going to be hardware security in the modern world, from things to cloud. Very interesting topic. I do not really want to go into the abstract of that one because the actual lecture you will be listening. It is our references only. But it will be my pleasure to introduce Devdip. Professor Devdip Mukhopadhyay is an Institute Chair Professor at the Department of Computer Science and Engineering, IIT Kharagpur. At IIT Kharagpur, he initiated Secured Embedded Architecture Laboratory, SEAL, focusing on hardware security. Prior to that, he was a visiting professor in the School of Computer Engineering, New York University, Abu Dhabi campus, and had a visiting position at NTU Singapore, New York University Shanghai, and Brooklyn. He was also an assistant professor at IIT Madras and held an adjunct position in our own IIT Bhubaneswar. He holds a PhD, MS, and BTech from IIT Kharagpur. His research interests are on the topics of cryptographic engineering, microarchitectural security, hardware security. Recently, he is integrated into adversarial attack on machine learning and encrypted computation, which includes homomorphic and computation and searchable encryption. Dr. Mukhopadhyay has published more than 250 papers in peer-reviewed conference and journals and is the editorial boards of program committee of several top journals and conferences. Currently, he is the editor-in-chief of the International Association of Cryptographic Research, Transaction in Cryptographic Hardware and Embedded System. He is a senior editor of IEEE Transaction of Information, Forensics and Security. He is a member of the IEEE Hardware Security and Standard Committee. Devdip is the recipient of prestigious Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Award in 2021 for Science and Engineering, and for his highest science honor in India below the age of 45 for his radical contribution to fault attacks, microarchitectural security, and crypto engineering that holistically bridges the spectrum from mathematical foundations to practical attack scenarios. He is fellow of the two Indian National Academies, National Academy of Science and Academy of National Science Academy and the National Academy of Engineering, and a fellow of the Asia Pacific Artificial Intelligence Association for contribution to information security. He was a fellow of cyber security and cyber security for cyber physical systems, innovation hub of IIT Kanpur. He has been enlisted in Asia's most outstanding researcher, compiled by Asian Scientific Magazine. He was awarded the Qualcomm Fellows Faculty Award of 2022, Khosla National Award of IIT Roorkee 2021, DST Swarna Jayanti Fellowship of 2015 and 16, INSA Young Scientist Award, INAE Young Engineers Award, and Associateship of Indian Academy of Sciences, and is a senior member of IEEE SEM. And I'm sure his talk is going to be very, very interesting, and with all this background, I would also like to say that this distinguished lecture series, which is actually 42nd, we aim to say complete 50 number by end of December. And in November itself, there are 6 lectures scheduled. I will request all of you to register and join in. They are going to be very, very interesting. Now, for the information of those who have come here for the first time, this series of lecture is being organized by, number of institutions jointly: SOA University, IIT Bhubaneswar, IMMT Bhubaneswar, Niger Bhubaneswar, and IEEE Bhubaneswar chapter. So, and it is customary that the participating institutions who are there, they may like to say something about their institutions. So I see Professor P.K. Nanda, who is the Vice Chancellor of this Shiksha Anusandhan University, is present here. I don't know whether IIT Bhubaneswar Director or IMMT, anybody is present here. I will request Professor Nanda to speak a few words about this Shiksha Anusandhan University. And then actually we'll pass on the baton to Devdeep for his lecture. Professor Nanda, please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Esteemed Chairman of our Advisory Board, Professor Damodar Acharya, and also Chairman of the INAE Bhubaneswar chapter, and today's speaker, distinguished speaker, Professor Devdeep Mukhopadhyay, and Director of IIT Bhubaneswar, Professor Sipat Karmalkar, Professor Hirendranath Ghosh, Director of Niger, Professor Amanuj Narayan, Director of IMMT Bhubaneswar, Professor Renu Sharma, the coordinator of this program, all the distinguished fellows and members of this INAE, and all the distinguished participants in today's lecture. It's my pleasure to share a few words about this university. This university started in 1996, became University 2007, and currently this year in the NRF ranking as a university category, we are 14th among the university category, and also 26th in the engineering category, and 21st in the medical and Institute of Dental Science and Institute of Faculty of Legal Science. They are in the top 10, 9th in the NRF ranking. Our university also started this concept of lecture series during COVID, and we have a SOA fortnight lecture series, and this is also a very distinguished lecture series where we are participating, and we are happy that chairman sir, actually esteemed chairman sir, has roped in very distinguished speakers, eminent speakers in their respective field, and we are happy to be part of it. Our university is very proactive in conferences, seminars, lecture series, and other activities. So this is one of the activity where we are also very proactive, and to be part of this activity, or fortunately part of this activity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Nanda. Do we have any friend from NISER or IMMT or IIT Bhubaneswar? Anyway, now I'll request Professor Devdik Mukhopadhyay to take it over from here and present his distinguished lecture.
Okay. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. So thank you, sir, for this very kind introduction, and also thank you to all of you for this, very warm welcome. So it's my pleasure and honor to deliver this talk at this prestigious forum. So as was mentioned, the title of my talk is Hardware Security in the Modern World, from Things to Cloud. So through this, right, I will try to give kind of a glimpse of the kind of works that we are also doing at IIT Kharagpur in this context, and also try to kind of bring out some of the important areas that I believe, as a research community, as a nation, should potentially look into this very important topic, in my opinion. So as was mentioned that I work in the topic of hardware security, and I would like to kind of mention here that we are a group of researchers at IIT Kharagpur. We call it as the SEAL family, Secured Embedded Architecture Laboratory, which primarily looks into the various attacks and countermeasures. And we have been trying to set up this lab from around 2008, and so it has been around 16 years of work that we essentially are trying to summarize in this talk. So we are very happy to kind of mention that we had graduated around 18 PhD students. Out of them, many of them, I would say precisely 9 of them, are right now faculty at various IITs and important institutes. So they are also trying to kind of spread this word of hardware security in various contexts. So just to give a little bit of background, so we are a group, as I mentioned, which started to work on VLSI of crypto systems. So it was started with the design of AES, or the Advanced Encryption Standard, which is now the de facto worldwide encryption that is being used. So we started to look into formal verifications for finite field circuits, and then we try to look into side channels, and I will try to mention a little bit more elaborately on what side channels mean, and various countermeasures to prevent against these attack vectors. Recently, we are working on quantum resilient crypto systems, or what are called as post-quantum crypto implementations. I will talk a little bit about micro-architectural attacks. Okay. So yeah, so we also work in the topic of micro-architectural attacks, which is basically the confluence of computer architecture and security, and I will try to elaborate more on this topic. We work in the area of Trojan designs and detections, and this is also another very important, that is something that we are working very, very actively on. We work in the area of physically unclonable functions, so I will try to talk a little bit about this promising hardware security primitive and what exactly we are working on in this context. We are very much interested to look into the impact of security on IoT subsystems, and I'll talk a little bit about some of our findings in this context. Cyber physical systems is also another natural area of work. Physical hardware assurance by imaging. This is a new laboratory that we are developing, and at the end, I will try to shed some light on this activity. And we are also working on privacy enabling techniques, because as we know that data is a very important day-to-day aspect in our modern lives. And how do we really ensure privacy? And I'll talk about few of the things that we are working in this context. So so let's get started. So the topic that I'm trying to kind of hint at, which is basically hardware security, tries to address the gap between theory and practice. So let me try to kind of elaborate a little bit more on this. So we know that knowingly or unknowingly, right, we are all kind of exchanging data, and we are right now using various kinds of, like data transfer over the computer networks. We are doing e-commerce, we are doing, like our day-to-day transactions, we are sharing our data over social media, we are browsing the network. All of these imply that we are exchanging our coveted information, our private information, sensitive data over the channel, which is often kind of eavesdropped by the adversary. So in this case, in this slide, you can see here two legitimate end parties, say Alice and Bob, who are communicating. And there is always an eavesdropper, say Mallory, who is trying to kind of observe the communication channel. And the attacker, or like the eavesdropper, is curious about the secret key. Now, we know that there has been so much development of cryptographic algorithms, theoretical foundations on cryptographic algorithms. So we can kind of reasonably kind of, like claim that the normal or the usual exchange of the inputs and the outputs, which means the message and the cipher texts, probably can be, probably can be trusted upon not to leak information about your private data, which is the secret key, or your password, or your confidential information. However, there is always a limitation of this cryptographic theory, and therefore, because of this absence, even mathematically strong ciphers can leak in the real world. So, for example, if you are carrying a, like a crypto device on your credit card, and if they are not protected by certain techniques, then they can often be gleaned by adversaries to know what is the secret information. So, this genre of work, or this domain of work, is what I work mainly on, which is called as side channels. So side channels in the real world basically kind of observe this leaked information, and the idea is that through these leakage sources, a cryptographic module, a module which has been protected by well formed, like theoretically constructed cryptographic algorithms, can leak information. And therefore, it is extremely important to protect the implementations. And I will try to kind of emphasize this point, that often these attack techniques are not what, like exposes the algorithm, but what we try to hint at is that the problem lies in implementation, which is basically the where you translate the theoretical ideas to practical instances. So this has been essentially the main, like focus of my work, translating theory to practice. And when we design secure cryptographic systems, we often see that in theoretical statements, we make, for example, a statement like, suppose there is a mathematical group where there is a hard problem, which essentially means that there are some, like mathematical problems which are believed to be extremely difficult to solve. So, for example, it could be a discrete log problem. On the other hand, when you really want to build a crypto system using these instances, then you need an instantiation. For example, it could be an elliptic curve cryptographic algorithm on which the relevant problem is, say, the elliptic curve discrete log problem. So on what we are expecting theoretically is that somebody who breaks into our cipher needs to solve this hard problem. However, it may happen that there will be, when you are targeting a real life implementation, there can be a plethora of attacks that can break these real world ECCs or elliptic curve crypto or any other crypto system for that matter without even trying to solve the ECDL2 problem. So in this case, the real core problem lies in how you implement the standard curves, and there is always a chance that how you are implementing, there is a bug, there are some mistakes. And these mistakes are not the traditional bugs, like they are not like functional bugs, because functionally these codes will work as expected. However, there may be various kind of manifestations. For example, there could be a time dependence, there could be an energy dependence on your secret data, which can be observed by the adversary and exploited. So therefore, we need in this, for example, there is this famous work by Dan Bernstein and Tanya Lange, where they mention about safe curves, which kind of motivates the implementers to choose safe curves rather than using just mathematically secure instances. So this has been, like the main focus of my work, because we know that in theory and practice are same, but in practice they are not. And this kind of work is what I call as cryptographic engineering, where you try to engineer the cryptographic solutions on various software platforms, hardware platforms, and also on firmware platforms. So we'll try to kind of take a look at this, and how we started to look at this is basically like, let's start with this example of advanced encryption standard. So this essentially is abbreviated as AES and is now the worldwide de facto standard from around 2001 for various kinds of cipher implementation. More specifically, these are like what are called as block ciphers because it encrypts block of information, and they're extremely high performance, and therefore they are used in various applications. It could be, for example, just to mention some of the recent implementations, and I will talk about this at the end. They are used often in what are called as searchable symmetric encryptions, or abbreviated as SSE. And these are techniques which kind of ensures that your data is private and encrypted on the cloud. But on the other hand, you can, or at the same time, you can also perform, say, a search operation. Because we usually know that when you're doing a search, then the server has to kind of decrypt information if you're using, like standard encryption techniques. But we will see, like various cryptographic techniques which eventually are developed using these kind of transformations, which also tries to kind of not only address security, but also tries to address the privacy of information. So they are extremely used in, like commercial products or consumer products. Even modern day processors like Intel, for example, have specific instruction set extensions for supporting these kind of crypto algorithms like AES. So therefore, this essentially is, you can kind of fairly bank on the mathematical, like soundness of these algorithms. However, strong cryptographic algorithms or like properly mathematically designed crypto systems are just the beginning. So that means that suppose I take your credit card, and suppose you are kind of, like banking on the protection of a nice mathematically constructed crypto algorithm, and you exchange the normal input and the output, your data might be safe. But however, the attacker, right, can potentially not only just observe the input and the output, can also kind of, like take an observation or look into maybe the power supply or maybe the electromagnetic radiations around this device, and from there try to derive information about the secret key. So this essentially has been, like the broad area of or like direction of attacks. Say, like if I observe the power consumption of a particular computation, that may give me trivially the secret key. In this case, specifically, right, I'm showing you that kind of power glitches or power traces or power consumption traces of a specific operation in a crypto algorithm. Specifically, it's a modular exponentiation algorithm. So in modular exponentiation, the idea is that you take some kind of exponent and you kind of raise it to some secret data. So on the other hand, right, when you implement these kind of algorithms on in an efficient manner, you do not, like suppose if I want to compute say x power of d, which is, like where d is a secret, I will typically not multiply x d times, because that is just not possible, because d often is a very large number. It could be a 1024-bit or a 2048-bit string. So therefore, the technique that is usually used is what is called as a square and multiply algorithm, which means that I take the exponent and I expand it as a 0, 1 vector, and then I implement it only by performing a squaring operation, except that if there is a 1, I do an additional multiplication. What that also means that when there is this additional multiplication, there is an effect or an impact on the power consumption, and the power consumption increases, and this increase essentially is observed by the adversary, and from there the adversary can trivially gain information about your secret exponent. So this has been a classic form of attack which was demonstrated by a paper long back in around 96 and showed that side channels can be a real threat to crypto devices. So when you try to kind of observe these kind of power traces on modern day ciphers like AES, so this particular slide shows you some such snapshot. For example, on the slide, the red curve that you see are an example of how the power trace would look like when you're executing an AES on a crypto algorithm. You can virtually see that there are 10 distinct jumps in this operation, and these actually correspond to some repeated operations in the AES algorithm, which are called as the rounds, and exactly the number of rounds and the number of jumps will match with your definition of the algorithm. So that means that just by looking at the power trace and the fact that there are variations which depends upon the various underlying operations, you can essentially gain some information about the algorithm. So these variations which occurred because of the underlying computations, and because of the fact that the computations depend the power depends on these computations, these are called as what are abbreviated as simple power attacks or SPA. Now simple power attacks or SPA can sometimes be exploited, as I showed you in the previous example, to directly get you the key. But in certain cases like AES, the recovery of the key may not be so straightforward. In those cases, we develop another type of attack, which are called as differential power attacks or DPA, where the variations which are exploited are because of the underlying data. So they are kind of like exploiting the data dependence of power. And this is even more fundamental, which means that if you even try to protect your crypto device against a simple power attack or SPA, they may still be vulnerable to differential power attack. So this analysis was originally proposed by in around 99, and it was probably the first academic exercise by Paul Kochard and their colleagues to show that power attacks or power consumption attacks, or like in a similar fashion, you can also do with electromagnetic attacks. One can kind of gain information about the secret data, irrespective of the fact there are potentially multiple things that are happening on the same device. These attacks are so powerful they can even like virtually recover the secret data or the secret keys. And I will try to motivate later that even by increasing the key length, you cannot defeat against these attacks. You cannot defeat these attacks. So here are some traces to show you how a DPA or a differential power attack would look like, say, in the context of AES. And these attacks are divide and conquer attacks, which means you do not try to guess the entire key at once, because simply that is not possible. In case of AES 128, the key size is 128 bits, which means that the total number of guesses is something like 2 to the power of 128. And that's a huge number, probably more than the number of particles in this universe. So a brute force search cannot be done. On the contrary, these attacks are like based on divide and conquer attacks, which means they try to kind of recover like the kind of key bits, like the corresponding key bits, using a divide and conquer technique. So for example, it could be that they first target the first byte, then they will target the second byte, and so on. In this case, we are showing you that with the 15,000 observations, somebody has been able to observe some distinguishable spikes in the like in the statistically processed data, and therefore can identify and distinguish the correct key byte from the wrong key bytes. So this technique essentially, I mean, the very standard technique that we usually follow is what is called as the correlation power attack, or abbreviated as CPA. So interestingly, CPA is a very powerful method of performing these side channel attacks. And recently this year, this particular work has received what is called as the Test of Time Award, which means that it has got a huge impact in industry. So let us try to understand how a CPA or a correlation power attack works. So the idea is that these attacks can be performed either from the plain text or the ciphertext. So by plain text or ciphertext, I mean that the plain text is the original input message that you're giving to the cipher, to your encryption algorithm. And the ciphertext means that it is the encryption result that you are obtaining from the encryption algorithm. So it's similarly like you feed the ciphertext to your decryption algorithm and you get back the plain text if you know the secret key. But in this case, imagine that there is an encryption algorithm of which you do not know the secret key, but you are observing the power traces or the electromagnetic traces, and from there you are trying to get the secret information. So let us try to see how one can do that. So in this case, suppose you have got say 1,000 encryptions. Say let's say that there are like 1,000 encryptions that you are doing. In a general sense, let us assume that there are D encryptions that you are doing, and you are trying to kind of guess, say, one part of the key. In the context of AES, there are 16 bytes in the key. 16 into 8 is 128. But you do not guess the entire 128-bit key at once, but you try to guess a portion of the key. Say, let's say the first byte of the key. Now, the first byte of the key, it being a byte, then there are 256 possible values. And these are the potential hypotheses that this key byte can take. So in this case, I write them as K1, K2, and so on, maybe as KK. So that means there are 256 possible values of this key hypothesis. So now I know the encryption algorithm. So what I do is I kind of like do an initial transformation of between this plain text byte and my key hypothesis. Say let me make initially my key hypothesis to be 0, and I perform or compute an intermediate round of this crypto algorithm, and I come to some byte that I compute. So now, once I obtain this byte, I apply my most favorite power model. So by power model, I mean that in VLSI, there are some like hypothetical powered models. In the simplest case, it could be a Hamming weight powered model. The idea is that through these powered models, you try to kind of estimate, albeit without the noise, the what is called as the dynamic power consumption of the device. So in this case, I kind of like find out the the Hamming weight of this byte. And likewise, I essentially perform this operation for all the D observations that I'm doing. So if I'm doing 1000 encryptions, I essentially have a column which essentially has got 1000 rows. So note that this particular column has been obtained by the key hypothesis, which was 0. I can similarly make a key hypothesis 1, I can make a key hypothesis 2, I can make a key hypothesis like this 255. So there are 256 possible key hypotheses that are feasible, and therefore this particular matrix has 256 rows, I mean 256 columns, each of them referring to one of my key hypotheses. And there are 1000 rows or D rows, each of the rows corresponding to the number of the encryption that you are doing. So now also keep in mind that the attacker has also observed the 1000 power traces or electromagnetic traces. And the idea is that for all the 1000 encryptions or de-encryptions, you essentially try to sample this particular trace, electromagnetic trace or power trace at say t different intervals. So you have an oscilloscope, and the oscilloscope has got a specific sampling rate, and this essentially has been observed and stored in the form of a matrix. So this matrix also has 1000 rows because there are 1000 encryptions, but there are t columns because each of those time instances are denoting the real vector that you're observing from the power trace. So now note that there will be a specific key hypothesis which is correct, and there will be a specific time when that key is essentially performing the underlying computation. So therefore, what the attacker now does is, in order to find out which key hypothesis was correct, he tries to kind of perform a correlation, and you can choose any, like your favorite correlation. The one of the most commonly used correlation is what is called as the Pearson's correlation, and I try to correlate these columns with the corresponding columns of this real matrix. And the idea is that if my key hypothesis was correct, and definitely out of these 256 possible values, one of the key hypotheses will be definitely the correct key hypothesis, there will be a starch increase in the correlation, and that is essentially observed in this correlation matrix. So whenever there is an increase in the correlation, you essentially try to kind of split, or comment or return that you potentially you have found out your key hypothesis or the key byte. And likewise, this attack has been done or performed in all the key bytes, and they can be done in parallel. So in order to recover one key byte, right, therefore the complexity is 2 to the power of 8 because there are 256 possible values. And since you can do this in parallel for all the 16 key bytes, the complexity is something like 16 multiplied by 2 to the power of 8. On the other hand, if you had done a brute force search, that would be 2 to the power of 8, but raised by whole raised to the power of 16, which is very large. But in this case, the complexity is amortized, and it is something like 2 to the power of 8 multiplied by 16, which is like around 2 to the power of 12, which is fairly manageable, around 1000 possible efforts. So therefore, right, it is a very simplistic overview, but it shows, like that how to kind of perform a correlation power attack, or what is called as a CPA, to know the various key bytes. And again, note that since it's a divide and conquer attack, which means you are recovering the key bytes in a byte by byte fashion, even if you increase the key length, like make it from 128-bit to 256, or even beyond that, these attacks will still work. And that is the reason why they are so powerful. So this essentially is, is one flavor of attacks that we have been working on. So I will subsequently talk about another flavor of side channel attacks that we are also very much interested in, which are called as fault attacks. So we try to look at cryptographic implementations, but with a faulty perspective. So let me try to kind of give the background behind this direction of work. So in these directions of work, the idea is that imagine that when there is a crypto device that is operating, and there is some kind of random perturbation in the environment. So it could be probably, like there is a voltage glitch, or potentially, like there could be maybe a clock glitch, or maybe there is an electromagnetic gun. In this case, you can see there is a laser gun shooting at your device. There could be a potential electromagnetic, and I will talk a little bit later on, trying to show you an actual video demonstration of how potentially these attacks can be performed. There could be also techniques which are called as row hammers. So row hammer is essentially a method which tries to exploit reliability issues in your DRAM chips or your dynamic RAM chips. So we know that our DRAM chips, they need to be kind of remember data by a process called recycling. They need to be refreshed at a specific rate. So it is usually around 64 millisecond. But somebody, showed that what you can do is, if you are writing an attack code, what you can do is that you can kind of run potential, like spy program which accesses the memory again and again at a very fast rate, faster than the refresh cycle, which creates bit flips inside the memory. And if these faults happen, then the question is, right, what do you really do? In normal situations, if there is a fault happening in our computations, then we just repeat it because we think that, okay, there was a fault, so let me just repeat this operation. But I will try to kind of motivate in this talk also that even for very standard algorithms like AES, a single fault can essentially compromise your secret data or the secret key. So that means that if there is a fault, it can potentially, it could have diverged your secret key. And therefore, if you just repeat the computation with the same secret key, then you are essentially, communicating without any encryption, which is kind of really, really scary. So therefore, we essentially did significant amount of work to kind of look into various kinds of fault or fault injection methods. As you can see here, these are some kind of infrastructure that we have built at IIT Kharagpur in our field lab, and I'll try to kind of give you a perspective on this kind of attacks as well. So this brings us to the discussion on fault-based cryptanalysis, where you have got a plain text and you have got a fault-free cipher. On the other hand, maybe what we can do is that when there is an encryption that is happening in, an attacker can try to kind of perturb the environment by the various techniques that I mentioned, and that leads to a fault induction and a faulty ciphertext. And then the question is, can I analyze the fault-free cipher and the faulty cipher, and from there try to kind of discover what was the secret key. So with this motivation, this was also something that I started during my PhD days. I kind of try to look into the behavior of the fault. So imagine that there is an AES that is working, and there is a fault that happens inside this computation, and then this fault propagates through the AES transformation. So in this particular slide, I show you the last 3 rounds of the AES algorithm, and imagine that because maybe of a clock glitch, there is an unknown fault that happens. So note that at this point, you have no knowledge about the fault. So if you, for example, consider on a 1 byte of the fault, then this particular faulty byte can take any of the possible values. However, when the fault propagates through the cipher, there are certain transformations. In this case, there are certain linear transformations which creates relationships between these faulty bytes. For example, if you're observing this column, you will see that this column has got relationships. Like, for example, 1 byte is double the other. There is 1 byte which is equal to the other byte. There is 1 byte fault which are 3 times the other y. These are, based on some mathematical, constructs which are called as finite fields. But without those, even those details, you can see that there are nice relationships among these faulty bytes. Now, this fault further propagates in the cipher and eventually pollutes the entire ciphertext because AES is really a wonderful cipher. But however, the same diffusion property that kind of makes AES a wonderful cipher can be exploited because of these faults. So now what the attacker can do is attacker will try to guess the last round key and try to go back and see that whether these relationships are maintained. And if the guess was correct, then it will again see that these relationships exist. But if your guess of the key bytes are wrong, then you will probably not see these relationships and you will just see some kind of random ciphertext bytes when you are rolling back and you are undoing the encryptions. So therefore, this can be a mechanism to form equations and distinguish the correct key bytes from the wrong key bytes. So our analysis says that a single fault can reduce the AES key size to only 2 to the power of 8 values, which is like 2 to the power of, 8 means like 256 values. So, and a double fault can uniquely retrieve the key. So this work has been, I would say, one of the foundational works on fault attacks on AES, and this also has kind of, showed us various things. Like, for example, fault attacks can be performed on, most sophisticated crypto systems, and it has also kind of showed that modern day systems which are not really taking care of these kind of attacks can be really challenged because of these fault injections. So in particular, I would also say that fault attacks have been also used to break countermeasures, and we have shown that subsequently, in some of our recent works at Eurocrypt, that fault attacks can be also used to kind of challenge crypto systems. So, for example, in this work, we essentially develop an attack which are called as fault template attacks, and showed that even if the faults occur anywhere inside the encryption process, they can be attacked by techniques, and those techniques eventually lead to the leakage of the secret key. So more recently, there has been, like a work by, by a group which showed that these attacks, or I would say more, like precisely the attack that I just now mentioned to you, which is this single byte fault attack, essentially has been performed on an Intel machine, which is called as Intel SGX. And this attack essentially is called as the plunder volt attack. So the idea of plunder volt is that it tries to kind of play with the voltage frequency scaling which are available in modern day computing systems. And when they are essentially manipulating these, or like playing around with this voltage frequency scalings by some software mechanisms, then there are some violations that occur inside the computations. More precisely, there are single byte faults that occur, and the challenge is that you have to recover the attacker can, while it can create this kind of faults, they have to kind of recover the secret key by a single fault, because they do not get a second chance, because the system just gets probably rebooted or like shut down when the fault happens. But using this technique which I mentioned to you, a single fault, since it can recover the secret key, or it can reduce the key to only a paltry 256 possible values, a single fault can kind of like lead to the leakage of the key that you're using inside the trusted architecture of Intel. And this has actually led to the deprecation of Intel's SGX processor from its 11th generation family 10 years after we found out this original attack. So this shows a theory to practice translation can take potentially a significant amount of years, but therefore, right, it is extremely important for theoreticians and practitioners to work together in this field to eventually come up with secure systems. So continuing, like various kinds of, so this is the summary of the attack that I was mentioning. So, so this basically motivates that we have to develop fault tolerant architectures. So I will try to give you a little bit of overview about various kinds of fault tolerant architectures that have been proposed in literature. So the countermeasures are often divided into various classes, but broadly speaking, there are of two classes. So one class is what are called as detection-based countermeasures. So the idea is that when you are doing a computation, you don't do it once, but probably you do it twice. And that is what is called as space-wise redundancy. And you can eventually, like also perform the redundancy over time, and using various techniques like, like parity-based coding and so on, you can also try to kind of protect against the fault attacks. On the other hand, there is another class of like countermeasures that have been proposed, which are called as infection countermeasures. So these countermeasures, they don't really prohibit the exposure of the output to the adversary, but what they try to do is they try to kind of infect and pollute the output so that the outputs cannot be exploited. However, both these attacks or both these countermeasures have been found to have weaknesses. In particular, I would like to mention that if you talk about a detection-based countermeasure, what you are assuming, like as a natural reasoning why this countermeasure will probably prevent the attack, is that it is extremely difficult for the attacker to kind of implement or inject the same kind of fault in two instances. So let us assume that suppose like you have one byte of of a register which you are trying to fault. The probability that both the faults will be exactly the same is probably what you are expecting is like something like 1 by 2 to the power of n, if n is the bit length of the register. So while it is true for a random fault injection, I would like to kind of draw your attention to the fact that if the attacker is able to bias that fault induction distribution, then it can really make this attack work with a much higher probability, which can really lead to the collapse of this countermeasure. So this motivates the industry to kind of develop techniques for not only countermeasures, but also methods to evaluate these countermeasures. And one of the challenges that we found when we were working with industry, and we very much closely work with industry, is that your countermeasure, your detection techniques should not be intrusive. That means the detection techniques should be pretty much black box in their construction. So they should work without having entire details of my countermeasures. So in DAC, what we try to do in, which is one of the premier conferences in hardware designs, we came up with a method which just looks at the cipher and it tries to kind of perform various simulations. So more precisely, what we do is that we take the two fault values and we try to kind of simulate the behavior of the output, and then try to like analyze the output distributions by some kind of statistical tests. And the idea is that if these statistical tests are able to distinguish the distributions, then the output essentially is leaking information about the fault and subsequently about the secret data. So using a very simple technique, we were able to come up with a methodology called alpha, which helps us to understand whether the countermeasure is indeed able to protect and thwart these kind of attack techniques. So we at IIT Kharagpur set up an incubation which is called as ESP, or Embedding Security and Privacy. And and through this incubation, we also developed a tool which is called as a side channel evaluator tool, and this tool is what we call as a Anveshak tool, which is a completely open source platforms. And we try to kind of develop this tool and also commercialize and try to kind of like proliferate. One of the objectives is also to proliferate hardware security education around the country. So here is a quick tour of our side channel analysis setup at Secured Embedded Architecture Laboratory to give you a glimpse of the activity that I just now mentioned. Hope the video works. observing carefully, then we see that because of the fault, right, the value in this register changes at that point. So this shows the power of the EM based model. So that essentially is one flavor of side channels that we have been working on, basically trying to kind of exploit the fact that electromagnetic radiation and the power consumptions and the behavior under faults can be exploited for crypto systems. The other flavor of attacks, which essentially is extremely important in the context of hardware security, is called as microarchitectural attacks. And in these attacks, I will try to kind of focus about the gap that exists between hardware and software. So in particular, this attack became very powerful and like very popular because of this famous advent of attacks which are called as Spectre and Meltdown. So in this paper, what we found out is that what researchers showed is that because of things which are there in our modern day processors, which are often developed only with performance in mind, there can be security implications. For example, microarchitectural attacks, in this case, like what they try to kind of exploit is a specific feature in modern day processors, which is called as speculative execution, which means that suppose there is a branch statement, like there is maybe a password check that is there, and the usual way of implementing that would be through an if-else statement. That means there will be a code which says that if your password is correct, then you are allowed. If you are correct, if the password is not correctly entered, then you are disallowed. But then what the attacker showed is that because there is an underlying, like branch predictor inside your processor design, one can try to tame your branch predictor so that your branch predictor, since it is tamed towards probably, like accepting, what the processor will do is that even if you are entering a wrong password, it will speculate that your password is correctly entered, and it will go ahead and eventually find out that the password is wrongly entered, and then it will roll back and essentially kind of ensure that you are not really given a direct access. So while this works in a usual input output mechanism or input output access mechanism, the attackers can try to kind of observe the impact of the speculation on the underlying microarchitecture. So by microarchitecture in this case, I would say suppose like give an example of the cache memory. So what will probably happen is that because of this access that will happen to the data on which like your on which your coveted data is stored, right? I mean, essentially we'll have a footprint on the cache memory, and the attackers have got a plethora of methods to understand what is the content in the cache and try to kind of get your private information. So it could be your like password, or maybe your like confidential photos or emails and so on. So therefore, these attacks are extremely difficult because they are really hard to fix, because the reason is the underlying like hardware, and often they are a result of probably 20 years of evolution of modern day computers. So if you just like you cannot really roll back and go behind 20 years, and therefore, right, you need a patch, and most often you will find that these patches at the software level makes the system extremely sluggish and slow. So therefore, this kind of motivates that in modern days, right, you need to develop your processors with not only performance perspective, but also security as an utmost design for security, what we call as design for security criteria, along with the conventional area, power, and performance. So therefore, it is extremely important to mind the gap, and we need a holistic approach, because if we have a bad hardware, then no matter whatever secure systems we are building on, there will be always a potential source of leakage. So microarchitectures have been really like an important area of my direction of work, and I will try to give you a little bit of like sort of insight into this by looking at what are called as cache attacks. So we all know that cache is a very fast form of memory which sits between the like the microprocessor and the main memory. And the idea is that if data is available in the main memory, then they are kind of like suppose it works on the principle of what is called as locality, like by reference of time and space. And the idea is that if the data what you are accessing is again and again available, then or you are accessing some data in a repeated manner, then that data is brought into the cache memory. So the idea is that if now the data is available in the cache memory, then you get what is called as a cache hit, and therefore the access time is much less. On the other hand, if the if you get what is called as a cache miss, then the access time is kind of large. Okay, and because of this, what happens is that the access time becomes suddenly larger. So therefore, you need to kind of, like if you look at this from, like maybe let's consider a scenario where there is a server running an encryption software and there is a remote attacker who is sending data. So what it is doing is that it is kind of sending various information, maybe over a TCP network, and the server is encrypting and giving the data back. So the execution time, if the attacker is carefully observing this, will be a manifestation of various things. Of course, there will be a network delay, but along with it, it will be a kind of a combination of the number of hits and the number of misses that occur when you are running your server, and when you're running the crypto algorithm on the server. And this led to a very nice experiment by Bernstein, which is called as the Bernstein's cache time experiment. The idea is that if there is an AES, say, running or executing, and imagine, as I mentioned, that the AES is a 128-bit cipher, which means that there are 16 bytes, and you specifically focus again on 1 byte of the key. So you kind of fix this 1 byte plain text to say 00, and you give random values to the other remaining 15 bytes. And if you observe the timing, you will find out that potentially there is a nice timing behavior or characteristic of this timing pattern. So now what the attackers do is basically they kind of create a template of these timing patterns, and then they observe that when the key bytes are changed, then it is kind of similar characteristic, but maybe there is a shift. And this often happens because the cache line at which you get a hit is just a shift of the original, like position at which you got a hit. And this means that if you just perform a standard correlation between this timing characteristic, you can virtually read back the corresponding key. So these attacks were initially shown to be kind of possible for standard implementations of crypto devices. However, the question was, what does it happen if the table is very small? The reason why it becomes very challenging is because in a normal AES implementation, like if you look at the standard libraries which are there in Linux and so on, you will find out that there is a very popular library called OpenSSL, which uses or implements encryption or like AES by using a lot of lookup tables. Okay, and these lookup tables in the context of AES with in the standard implementation is something like 1 kilobyte implementation, and since there are 4 such lookup tables, the total size is 4 kilobyte. So now if you look at the like the distribution of the number of misses in this context, you will find out there is a nice bell curve that you give, and because of this you get a nice variation of timing, and therefore these timing variations are what are exploited by the adversary. And we can just do a simple math from this like equations to show that the difference of timing is proportional to the number of misses, and because there is a nice different distribution of the cache misses, you can get this differential in time, which you can try to exploit to get the secret data. However, when you implement these AES algorithms, which are much smaller table, which is possible, then you will probably not get this nice distribution. And that essentially means that if you are doing an encryption, since there are multiple tables, and because your table is small, intuitively you can believe that what will happen is that after a few accesses, the entire cache memory gets loaded into, the entire table gets loaded into the cache, and therefore you get a constant number of cache misses, and therefore it was widely believed that cache attacks are difficult over these systems. So in one of our projects that we had with like a lab in Japan, which is called as Entity Labs, we challenged a cipher which is called as Clefia, which was used to protect their like Sony's digital copyrights. And these ciphers were built using 256-bit tables, and therefore they were believed to be strong, kind of strong. However, we observed some interesting properties in the modern day processors, specifically like what are called as out of order executions, and the fact that you can essentially do pipelining in to handle cache misses when there is no dependence of the cache accesses, which can be exploited still to recover the key in something like less than 400 seconds. And we showed that this attack is possible on a plethora of modern day
I think you're muted suddenly. There is no audio.
Oh, that's really unfortunate, actually. Sorry, can you hear me now? Hello?
I had muted myself. Anyway,
Yes, sir,
yes,
you can hear you.
Okay. So, I don't know how much I was not audible. So what I was trying to say is that,
you go back 2 slides.
okay. Okay. So yeah, so I if it is 2 slides, it's fine. I mean, what I was basically saying is that this confluence of modern day architectures and attacks is something that essentially means that we try to look at various artifacts like hardware prefetchers, branch predictors, and so on, and eventually try to kind of model the leakages using by studying these computer architecture primitives. So I will try to kind of sort of draw this line by talking about an attack that we recently performed on what is called as a trusted execution environment, or TEE, which is the idea is that nowadays people designers often bank upon these worlds of what are called as TEs, or trusted execution environments. And the idea is that you try to kind of disentangle the various critical operations of your crypto devices, and the idea is that you try to run them on what are called a secure world, with the hope that even if your OS is compromised, they can still not be exploited. So the idea is that your entire security relies on hardware, okay, and you try to kind of implement isolations so that even if the operating system is compromised, they potentially cannot be used by attackers. So we try to look into one of these, and they're extremely important because ARM Trust Zone, Intel's SGX, all of them are essentially trying to kind of develop Ts to kind of secure our systems. So we try to look in order to understand or answer this question about really whether our attacks work on real systems. We try to kind of develop a work where we try to break Ts with a little bit of fault. So I will try to talk about this work that we recently published at a very top conference, which is called as NDSS. So the idea is that when you run a crypto device on the TE world, then normally there will be a cryptographic check, which means that you cannot run any code on this TE world. So the idea is that there will be some kind of cryptographic check. It could be a signature verification. It could be based on a digital signature, based on ECC, RSA, and so on, to ensure that a rogue does not run programs on the trusted world. So in our case, we try to look at what is called as OPT, which is a global platform API specification for trusted execution environment, and often used for various applications. So we try to take a look at the security code, which I show a snippet here. You can see here that there is an RSA check that you are performing. And according to the standard Linux convention, the idea is that if the check is correct, then it returns a 0 value. On the other hand, if there is a false data, that means the signature was invalid, then it returns a non-zero value, which you observe here. So now the idea is that this 0 value or non-zero value is eventually observed by the operating system. And according to this, the attacker is allowed or the attacker is disallowed. So now what we try to kind of, ponder upon is that what if I inject a fault by maybe some of the probes that I was showing? And the idea is that we targeted the bus, which was used to kind of transfer this information. And after few iterations, we found out that when we looked into the assembly and doing a little bit of reverse engineering, we found out that there is a specific register that you can potentially target by your EM probes. And whenever there is a non-zero value, we try to hit the EM or the electromagnetic pulse to kind of clean this register. So this is what we call as a register cleaning fault. So you kind of remove this and make it all zeros. And then the operating system believes that your code is correct and allows you to enter. So this particular attack, we kind of demonstrated on a real life OPT platform, which is implemented on a standard Raspberry Pi board, which probably many of you are using for developing IoT systems. It works on Raspberry Pi 3 and Raspberry Pi 4. And the idea is that we try to look at the crypto algorithm when the crypto just starts to run. How do we observe when the crypto starts to run is again by observing the electromagnetic traces, and see that suddenly when the crypto is executing, there is a burst of activity. And then at that point, you try to synchronize your electromagnetic pulse to kind of clean out this register and essentially run any rogue code. So we had various kinds of implementation demonstrations, and one of the demonstration we showed that even if there is a TE that is executing, you can virtually shut down the system, and that leads to kind of a complete violation of the TE architecture. So this is our laboratory setup through which you can see here that there is a the target and the probe, and we are essentially trying to kind of monitor the overall activity by this oscilloscope, and eventually with the objective of bypassing the T kind of check and eventually run any code on the trusted world. So I'll again try to give you a short video clip on this so that you get a feel of this attack, and yeah. So we made a responsible disclosure of this finding, and we eventually got a CV for this attack. So this is the target board, as you can observe here, the victim device. And we take our electromagnetic gun. You can see the pulse, the probe that we have here. And you are trying to kind of shoot EM pulses using this. This is a waveform generator that we are using to, send the pulses. So this is the pulse that you are shooting. And this is the oscilloscope which we are using to monitor when there is a burst. You know that there is a crypto that is starting, and you try to synchronize your fault injection at that time. So this is the target, the unfaulted execution, which is working perfectly okay. And now we will try to kind of inject the fault and eventually just shut down the system. So you can imagine that we can do this for critical devices as well, critical infrastructure as well. So this bar shows you the activity. So you can see here when we are shooting the pulse, when there is a crypto that just starts, and because of the fault, so in this case is an amplifier, so we have to amplify the fault injection so that the magnetic flux is significant, and this leads to an exception and eventually a reboot. So we can now get into the system and just perform a reboot. Yep. Sorry. So naturally this shows that these kind of techniques are even viable on even modern day deployed systems. So therefore it is extremely important to develop countermeasures, and we indeed worked with the OPT team and collectively developed a countermeasure which basically performs redundancy to ensure that the attack points are distributed over multiple positions so that it makes the job of the adversary more difficult. If some of you are interested, you can find that there is a GitHub link given here through which you can pull the request. And subsequently, if you are using, and this is available widely in the internet. For more details of this, you can find in the website of NIST with the CV, and you can find out that this patch is available so that you can thwart or prevent against such kind of fault injection based attacks. So now the question is that while it is really possible over embedded systems, what happens on trusted architectures on servers? So we are recently collaborating also with Intel and other processor designers, and here is an example of what we recently found on some of the Intel's trusted architectures, specifically SGX. This is a recent work that we have been performing and try to kind of look at again in the scenario where imagine that there is an like transient execution of a specific instruction, and the idea is that, as I was mentioning about speculation, so if in modern day processors, right, if for example in this case this is a specific instruction that is getting executed, and we found out that there is an instruction that essentially is based on like a modern day specific way of implementing what are called as fused multiply and FMA instructions. And what we did is that we observed that when these instructions are executing, and suppose there is a data dependence, and somebody finds out, or the processor finds out that there is an exception, then there is a rollback. But when you do a rollback, there are traces of information which could be available in various microarchitectural components. For example, in one of the recent SGX processes, we found out that there is data still available in the memory access units, which are on-code buffers, which can be exploited by adversaries. So what the attacker can now do is that while the attacker is, say, running its own gathered instructions, and if there is a victim thread that is performing like computations on sensitive data, for example, in this case, it is storing some value, say 0xFA. The attacker can also potentially read this by, like creating a similar kind of, like scenario where there is a violation because of speculation, and it does a rollback. But within this time, it could happen that your secret information is leaked to the attacker's thread. So this work we recently published at USNIX 2024 and showed that like Intel's IFMA instructions, which are used to accelerate crucial cryptographic operations, and they're often used for like implementing algorithms like RSA and so on, can be potentially also be exploited. So therefore, the like the fact is that these attacks are not really restricted to embedded devices, can also be potentially also like extended towards more sophisticated, high performance, trusted environments. So what about TDX, which is the recent, like I would say next generation to SGX, and indeed it is really a very good design. So in one of our recent works with Intel's TDX, we found out that it was a like a bounty program, which means we had an access to the Intel's TDX with the objective of finding out bugs. So the idea is that if you get bugs, then your students like potentially get some kind of reward for finding out these bugs. So we found out that while the virtualizations, these kind of systems are really well designed with lot of virtualization techniques, but we had a weird idea of using some kind of APIs to observe, say, the energy consumption of these devices, in particular, say, the temperature, like rise of the devices. So you can imagine, very simplistically put, that suppose there are two cores that are essentially residing on the same die, and the idea is that if you are performing a computation on one of the zones, which say you can think of that to be a trusted zone, there should be ideally an isolation, which means that you should not be able to kind of know what is the computation that is happening on the other core from another core. So our idea was very simple. We try to kind of use, or like these APIs to observe the heat consumption. And the idea was that if there is one core that you are targeting and that is performing a lot of computation, then the die will definitely get heated, and it is extremely difficult to virtualize these kind of sensors. And therefore, we try to look at these kind of, I would say, like elements which really are difficult to virtualize, and find out whether there is a kind of footprint of this from the other world. And we found out that indeed, right, you can perform fingerprinting, you can essentially virtually understand what kind of algorithms are running on the trusted world by just observing the signature of these power sensors. So in a work which we published recently at Host, we can show that even if there is a machine learning that is working, the question is, right, what kind of architectures are essentially really getting executed. There is a very strong fingerprint that is still observable across the codes. So this shows that isolation is really hard to build even in modern day systems, and often side channels essentially can really lead to the collapse of these kind of like isolations, or like something that I would say are really important, but at the same time quite sophisticated to build until unless you start your designs with those kind of objectives. So I would rather, like for the sake of time, quickly go ahead to talk about little bit about like security and privacy in the context of IoT. I think I have got maybe another 10 minutes to wind up probably. I'll try to talk about, the fact that modern day IoT systems are extremely complex, and therefore you will find out that there are several kind of weaknesses available. Like for example, in one of our works where we looked at some of the home lighting systems of which was deployed by Philips, we found out that the authentication was done on the clear, which that means that using simple tools like Wiresharks, you can potentially observe these kind of usernames and passwords and so on. So which means that security is extremely crucial, and therefore we the question is, right, what kind of security algorithms will we implement? So on the other hand, while we know that there are several nice cryptographic algorithms that have been developed, but they're extremely complex and they kind of consume power and energy significantly, which means that we need to look into new promising techniques. And this brings us to what are called as puffs, or physically unclonable functions. So the idea of puffs is very simple. If I take a puff and I implement on multiple devices, and if I give the same challenge to all these devices, then the responses should be statistically independent and also unique, which means that if I give you the response of one device, you should not be able to know what is the response of the other device. So this means that, if you can really implement a puff, then there are several advantages. It can reduce the cost, it can increase the security, and so on. So in one of our collaborations with Wipro, we try to develop a puff where there is an inbuilt, methodology of implementing the puff, which means that while, the puff responses are essentially stored in the cloud, but they are stored by kind of combining with a cryptographic technique, which are called as identity-based encryptions. And there is an enrollment phase and a specific verification phase to kind of, allow you to perform the verification, but you do not need to store explicitly the responses of the puffs on the cloud, so that the cloud is able to kind of observe them. And I think that is very important, because if you do not do that, and if the cloud has access to your verification database, then that also can be potentially subjected to attacks. So therefore, this work in TDSC, we try to kind of come up with one such technique and eventually integrate with some kind of video surveillance cameras and develop an end-to-end implementation of this. So if some of you are interested, then you can go to this link and you can get more information about this project. So for the sake of time, I will, talk about some recent work that we are trying to do in this context. And I will rather, I would say, go ahead and, sorry, and talk about, just to kind of wind up this discussion, I will talk about the other end of IoT. This is like I was talking about the end where your crypto runs, where there is an embedded device and so on. But what about the other end of the IoT? So the other end of the IoT is often the cloud. So you are having so much amount of data and information, and you are keeping this data onto the cloud. What about the privacy of that information? So in order to understand and appreciate this, or think about this, imagine that there is a search engine, and imagine that you are keeping your data onto the cloud and somebody is performing a search. So this is a kind of snapshot that I get from a promising tool in the internet, which says that it performs a search and it also allows it encryption. So it's called as searchable encryption. But very silently, it tries to kind of write somewhere that what it does, it basically decrypts your query, and then it performs the search. So that means that the cloud essentially is eventually able to observe everything, your data, your search patterns, your keywords, everything. So this is not exactly what we want. We want to really compute on encrypted data. And there are multiple techniques that you can probably look into in the literature. Like on one hand, you have got what are called as fully homomorphic encryptions, but they are really, really complex. So we of course work on FHE, but the thing that I would like to talk about is something a middle ground, which is called as searchable symmetric encryptions, or SSE. So the idea here is that there is a small cryptographic key, and if you are really interested to search, then what you do is that from the search you generate a token, and you kind of give the token to the server who is performing the evaluation. So an example query would be, suppose there is an encrypted email server, and you want all the emails with Alice and Bob as maybe the sender and the receiver, and with probably crypto as a subject. But all these tokens, like what we have as Alice, Bob, and crypto, they are not available in the plain text, but they're encrypted by some kind of transformation. And now what essentially is performed at the end of the server is essentially to kind of perform a search, but without really understanding what essentially has been searched on. So we looked into one such technique, which is called as oblivious cross tags, and I will not really go in or get time to talk about in details, but we really found out that there was very strong, like leakage that is called as file injection attack, and came up with a method that we published as CCS in 2018 and showed how you can make an end-to-end system where you can perform what is called as conjunctive search, like Alice and Bob and crypto, and still ensure that the server does not learn anything about what you are searching on. And we looked into like various just to give you a little bit of like a top level overview. So we had an experiment where we perform a search on around 60 GB of data, and you can really perform this search in less than 1 second, ensuring that the privacy guarantees are still maintained. So here is a quick demonstration that I'll try to show before I conclude my search, and you can see here that I'm trying to make a search or conjunctive search on the remote server. And I try to use my query. So here I use my query like AES and ECC, and I get and the server performs the search, but it does not use AES and it returns me a bunch of encrypted files which it can download at my end. And the server does not learn from the content, it does not learn from the paper, and essentially therefore my privacy. These are all the encrypted files which the server does not learn. So I can also like adapt my query, for example, I can consider my corresponding files that I download from the client list. I can also adapt my query by maybe adding how many matches happen, but really that's not the content. Really know what is the data and what is the keyword that is being searched on. So this is our, I would say, like the recent project that we are working on, and we are also trying to see that whether you can make it more efficient by, like developing FPGA-based implementations and so on. So to wind up, I would like to say that like we are also working on various future directions. Like for example, we are trying to develop a lab at IIT Kharagpur to like really look into the and introspect into the hardware. So here we have there was a famous China hack that really shook like the news, where they showed that these are like deployed computing systems in various social network environments, where there is a small PCB modification that has been done. As you can see that the size is probably smaller than the tip of your pencil. And they essentially have got these modifications with the capability of, like performing communications and so on without even, like the end parties or the OEMs knowing about these modifications. So how do you really know that your hardware systems that are around you are really trusted? So in order to kind of look into this, we have recently set up a laboratory, or we are trying to develop a laboratory for the last 3 years, where you can perform, where we have a scanning electron microscope and like X-ray microscope to kind of look into your devices. So for example, this is a MEMS chip that you can see here, smaller than maybe your coin, and we have zoomed in into this, like trying to kind of do a reverse engineering by, like removing the layers one by one and seeing inside the chip. For example, you can see here the layout of an antenna that is visible using our devices. So we are trying to combine this with side channel techniques, with various machine learning methods, and trying to come up with an end-to-end, like infrastructure through which you can, like screen your hardware security modules and kind of enhance the trust of your devices, of your implementations. So we are also working on post-quantum crypto systems. We know that quantum computers are, I would say, looming around us. So therefore, we need to kind of develop crypto systems which are resilient against quantum computers. So we have recently, like a project that we have got from the ministry to develop an ASICs on quantum resilient designs, and we are working on them. So I would like to kind of wind up my talk by saying that there are several attack surfaces, and a chain is no stronger than its weakest link, and therefore we need expertise in multiple domains to really eventually come together to build, like a total end-to-end world. So just to give you a little bit of background, so some of you are interested, there are these textbooks on hardware security, timing attacks, and so on, which you can have a look at. I also have a MOOC course on hardware security for any student who is observing. I would definitely, like try to kind of encourage you to take a look at them. And we also do a conference every year in India, which is like where many experts from around the world come in. All of you who are interested are welcome. This time we will do it in IIIT Kottayam. One of the reasons why I also do this conference every year in India is to promote Indian tourism, apart from the the research that we do. And finally, I would like to kind of stop here by saying that it is an important time to kind of look into our hardware devices. By the recent pager attacks that was mounted on by Israel and so on shows that like it is extremely imperative to really ensure that our hardware our hardware designs or hardware devices are really trusted. So it's time to kind of secure our systems before it's too late. Thank you for your attention. If there are any questions, I would be very happy to answer.
May I ask a question, please?
Yeah, please.
Please.
Okay. I have two questions. Both are highly non-technical. That's what I will do. So now, question one is, if I do, from what you had said, I got the impression that if I do a Google search, and then the search algorithm will catch, and then from there you can get the data from my laptop or mobile or something like that, if you are attacking that. Is that right? That is question one. Question two is that you just now talked about a pager. I was just wondering if a fellow is sitting in Israel and he is attacking a pager in Lebanon. I'm sure that Bluetooth does not have that much range. So he must have used some wireless. But in any event, how can you generate a signal that will burst a battery? Whatever you do, how can you generate a signal that will, say, supposing your PCB generates a signal? How does it burst a thing? What is the mechanism? How does it do? How does the battery burst? If it is having too much heat going, maybe yes. But I don't know how it can generate a thing at a precise time, 5,000 pages at the same time.
Yep. Yeah. So I mean, I cannot, of course, like give you a like a full answer, because you have to see the systems, and only then you can really give a categorical answer to the question. I mean, the second question more precisely. So I will rather answer the first question at the beginning. So what I mentioned is that when you are normally doing a search, like the standard search engines like Google, they can see your data, they can see your keywords, they can see your data, and so on. So what I just now mentioned is that we are trying to build a system, or what we call a searchable encryption system, where the server is not able to learn the keywords. They are not able to see what is your data that you are searching on. They are not able to see what you are searching on, and still you can perform your search. So that means that you need to kind of come up with crypto devices or crypto methods, but these methods are very carefully designed to allow that actually. And these are
Do they
different kind
already
of
exist?
systems that you need.
Do such devices already exist?
No. So you need to develop new algorithms. So what we are doing is we are trying to kind of work with our colleagues, and there are like multiple people working around the world on these techniques, through which we are trying to come up with new crypto systems which allow such kind of searchable encryption. So you can search, but your data is still encrypted. So you need to come up with sophisticated methods to do that, give mathematical proofs and guarantees for doing that. And literature now shows that yes, we are able to do that, but there are performance issues. So gradually they are getting more and more deployed, and like I would say, like very soon probably you will see them deployed. And actually, for example, I know there is a very famous database unit called as MongoDB. So right now MongoDB has actually procured these kind of techniques also into their systems, so that like they're getting more and more being deployed in our search engines and so on. But definitely it is a work, I would say, still in progress.
So by now, I'm searching a lot in Google, for example. So
Yeah.
my data is already might have got
Yeah.
compromised. It already might have been compromised.
Well, when you are searching things in data in Google, I mean, the idea is that these keywords are available to the server. The server is able to see that. But when you are performing e-commerce, like when you are say doing some kind of bank transactions or so on, then they are protected by natural techniques. So they are, like there is HTTPS and so on, TLS and so on, which is protecting your, like private data. But when you are just doing a search, then everything is visible. The server knows it actually.
Okay. Thank you.
So yeah, and talking about the second question, I would say that what it shows is that it is possible because it was demonstrated. And now how to do that? I mean, I would say that there are many methods to do a lot of things, and I don't think any one single technique works. There is infiltration onto your supply chain. There are like methods of like the row hammer attack that I was mentioning on. It just shows you I can send a JavaScript to your machine, and that will probably run in your system and corrupt your memory. I will probably even not even enter Bhubaneswar and I can do this attack actually, or any other place. I can do this in say, California or whatever actually. But the point is right that I mean, what you ask is a very important question, that how do you really synchronize such an attack over a large scale? I mean, I'm sure that there are insiders and there are a lot of things that potentially goes on overall in this activity. So it's not a single vector, but I would say a combination of vectors.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question? Any other question from anybody? I have a very simple query, Devdeep.
Yes.
See, particularly the senior citizens in this country, they're being subjected to the risk of cyber attack. And in the process, losing a lot of money. So, even I must admit here, once I was really affected by it, I didn't lose much, but 450 rupees I lost.
Yep.
So, what could be done? Because these devices, actually, whatever that we are producing, we are making them cheap. All these things are there, particularly mobile phones and etc. But the risk is very high in these areas.
Yep. So what is asked there, I think, is a very important question, and I would say that it is not only restricted to senior citizens. Even we who work in security get, get fooled actually. Okay, and I will be very candid about that, because many of these attacks that you are mentioning, they are based on social engineering, right? So they essentially try to kind of, like exploit the social interactions, our, our understanding of the social world, and they essentially also have a lot of information, because I would say, I think it is quite and I would say a concerning state of fact that we still do not have a very well formulated policy of sharing information, about sharing data. So many of our mobile phones and other information are available, right, and essentially available to the public world, and they're often exploited. So as a countermeasure, I think, of course, I would say a little bit of concern is important. So one thing is definitely to keep in mind is that many of the important messages, right, that comes to us over emails or over, like mobile communications, I would like to say that many of them, we should always be kind of a little bit having a paranoia in taking those information, and keep in mind that most of the important messages cannot come in that fashion. They still need to come over a hard copy, or like over a, like a real transaction. I mean, a real communication, a real mail. They should not come, like through a, like just a casually written email or a casually written, like mobile message or so on. So if we are a little bit careful about this fact, and like keep in mind that, like let's not address a, like issue immediately, but maybe a little bit procrastination, I think, would be helpful in this context. Procrastination is normally not good, but maybe in answering these messages can be quite beneficial, actually, I would say.
Okay. Thank you so much for this excellent lecture.
Thank
May
you,
I now request Renu Madam to please propose a vote of thanks. Hello.
Thank you, sir. I'm audible, sir.
Please.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Honorable Chair, INAE Bhubaneswar Chapter, Chairman Advisory Board, Shiksha Anusandhan Team to be University, Professor Damodar Acharya, respected Professor Devdeep Mukhopadhyay, esteemed colleague, faculty members, students, and distinguished guests of INAE, fellow members INAE. It is my distinct honor and privilege to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of Shiksha Anusandhan Team to be University, INAE Bhubaneswar Chapter, CSIR MMT Bhubaneswar, IIT Bhubaneswar, NISER Bhubaneswar, and IEEE Bhubaneswar subsection for the 42nd INAE Distinguished Lecture. On the onset of this, I would like to express our profound gratitude to the Professor Devdeep ji from Institute of Computer Science and Engineering, IIT Kharagpur, for delivering today's enlightening talk on hardware security in modern world from things to cloud. Professor has highlighted many areas, several critical topics, including the threats to the modern hardware systems, side channel attacks, security cryptographic implementations, emerging trends, such as integration on artificial intelligence for both offensive and defensive strategies, and its impact on the hardware security, design challenges, and the future opportunities. Through his lucid presentation, Professor Mukhopadhyay illuminated how hardware security is no longer a niche subject, but an essential aspect of digital life, impacting industries, national defense, and personal privacy alike. Once again, I extend our heartfelt thanks to Professor for sharing his deep expertise and stimulating thought-provoking discussions. We are certain that today's lecture will inspire future researchers and innovation in the domain of hardware security. I also take an opportunity to thank all the dignitaries, participants, and the members of the organizing committee from our partnering institutes for their support in making this event a grand success. With that, I conclude. Jai Hind. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Now, may I request our friends to put on your videos so that we can take a photo. Anyway, whatever it is, please take a photo. Now, one more last thing, what I'd like to say, Professor Devdeep, and we'll send a sort of a small memento to you by post, so that actually we can remember
Thank you very
us in future. Now,
Thank you very much.
of course, this will be sent by post very soon. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your excellent lecture.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Okay,
Nice to meet you all. Happy Diwali.
Happy Diwali.
Happy Diwali, sir. Namaste.
Okay.
Happy Diwali, sir.
Bye.
Happy Diwali. Very happy Diwali. Oh God. Devdeep chadidalanda. Phone mein kotha. Okay. Thank you.